From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Inside Politics from Please Explain. I'm Rachel Clun, filling in for Jacqueline Maley. It's Friday, July 7. Earlier this year, the federal government declared war on vaping.
In one of the biggest health reforms in a decade, the federal government will ban recreational vaping.
Change Australian vaping laws. In a world first that could see most e-cigarettes banned, plain packaging.
They were sold as a therapeutic device that would help smokers quit. Now the evidence is that vapes or e-cigarettes are doing the opposite and growing a new generation of nicotine addicts.
Health Minister Mark Butler announced a blanket ban on disposable vapes, vowing to rid Australia of the e-cigarettes that have ignited a health crisis amongst teens.
That is what it's become. The biggest loophole, I think, in Australian healthcare history. 1 in 6 teenagers aged 14 to 17 has vaped. 1 in 4...
It's the biggest smoking reforms this country has seen in more than a decade.
This is a product deliberately targeted at our kids, being sold alongside lollies and chocolate bars. Vaping has now become the #1 behavioural issue in high schools, and it's becoming widespread in primary schools as well. Over the past 12 months, Victoria's Poisons Hotline has taken 50 calls about children under the age of 4 ingesting vapes. Under the age of 4.
But there are now concerns that Australia's world-first blanket ban on vaping without a prescription could actually make the problem worse. This week, our papers published private correspondence from some members of a government advisory body. They expressed concerns the government's blanket ban would fuel the black market and end up criminalising more people unnecessarily. Today, Federal Health reporter Natassia Chrysanthos and senior writer with Good Weekend magazine Tim Elliott join me to discuss Australia's vaping problem and whether the Albanese government's harsh crackdown is a mistake. Tim, I wanted to start with you. Last month, you wrote a feature for Good Weekend magazine about the vaping crisis amongst young Australians. You've got 3 daughters who clearly provided a lot of insight for the story. So can you tell me about what you learned through the process of reporting this piece and about some of the young people you spoke to for it?
Well, one of the things, the main thing I guess I learned was just how pervasive it is and how pernicious it is. I talked to quite a few young women, including my 3 daughters. I've got a 20-year-old, a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old. And they all, all of their friends, it's totally normalised. I mean, it's like smoking was maybe in the 60s, 70s. Everybody does it. It's, if you're with friends hanging out, it's as normal as eating a packet of chips or looking at your phone. And part of the reason for this is they're, easy to get, cheap. You can hide vapor easier than you can smoke. I mean, the girl that I spoke to, Jade, not her real name, she was utterly addicted, found it really hard to give up, smoking the equivalent of like one stage 10 packs of cigarettes every 4 days. And she said it was really easy to do. She actually vaped on a plane, vaped in a car beside her father without him knowing. So it's everywhere, yeah. My youngest daughter, 14, she was at a swimming carnival recently and we were talking about it. She said bunches of girls were just taking off to the toilets together and vaping, coming back. It's everywhere.
It sounds really pervasive, but it's not just a problem among teens, is it? The Health Minister, Mark Butler, has previously said there are as many as 2 million vapers in Australia. It's clearly a habit that's been taken up by teens and adults alike. So give us a sense of the scale of this problem, Natassia.
So as Tim alluded to anecdotally, it is really pervasive. One of the latest studies we've got, and it's worth noting, the 2 million kind of mark has been put out there by Butler before. Other industry groups have put out about 1 million adult vapers. A lot of the studies have focused on teenagers because that's where a lot of the concern is. So the latest info we have was a study published earlier this year in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Public Health, which surveyed 1,000 young Australians. And the rates in that study were 1 in 6 teenagers between 14 and 17 had vaped, and a quarter of 18 to 24-year-olds had vaped. And of that latter group, 14% were current vape users. So to put that in perspective, the rate of daily smokers among that age group is about 7%. So it is a real significant uptick in the rates of smoking that we had seen previously. So it's not just people who have smoked and moved to vaping. There's obviously a whole new portion of people who are vapers alone.
Okay, and earlier this year, Butler announced a plan to try and crack down on this problem. And what he announced was a world first. So can you tell me about it, Tim?
So it's actually the second attempt. So he tried in October 2021, I think. Federal government came out with a whole bunch of initiatives. To restrict the access to vapes. They didn't work. But now it's a big step up because the government has banned the importation of non-prescription vaping products, including those that do not contain nicotine. Vape products also now require pharmaceutical-like packaging to declare their nicotine concentrations, and all single-use vapes will be banned, and you will not be able to buy them from convenience stores. So that's a really good move. And importantly, more doctors will be able to prescribe vapes so that people who need a vape to quit smoking can more easily get them. The idea is called the medical-only access. So now, rather than convenience stores and the retail sector largely being the gatekeepers to, being able to sell them, the medical system is now the gatekeeper to access to vapes. And I think that's a really good thing.
So, Natassia, how will this be enforced?
So I think enforcement will really be key to trying to make this vaping ban 2.0 work, because as Tim was saying, we've had this medical access model since 2021 when Greg Hunt introduced it. But the main criticism of that attempt has been there were never proper resources allocated either at a federal or state level to make it work. And there were also some legal loopholes which will change. So, for example, in the 2021 model, Border Force, if they do seize vapes at the border, because they're not necessarily labelled as containing nicotine, have to go then send those vapes back to the TGA. The TGA has to test them. If the TGA finds out they do have nicotine, which many of them do but are not labelled as such, they then send them back to Border Force, and then Border Force can go about destroying them. Whereas under this new model, because disposable vapes are just banned outright, nicotine or not, it will eliminate that process because Border Force can identify at the onset that these are products that aren't supposed to be making their way into Australia. But the other element of that, which kind of remains the same, is around illegal retail sales, particularly to under 18s. And that's where state and territory police forces are also going to need to have beefed up resources to actually go into those shops at that second stage when they have made it through the border and shut down or penalise retail sales. And that's where I think historically there's been a bit of buck passing between state and federal governments. So that cooperation is going to be really essential if this is going to work, as will quite significant funding. And at the moment, that's where there's still a question mark in that the government hasn't told us how much this is going to cost and how much it's going to need to spend to enforce this ban.
And not everybody is happy about this ban either, are they, Natassia? This week, you uncovered some private correspondence among members of a government advisory body, and they've cast doubt on the effectiveness of banning vapes and raised questions about why the Health Minister would have taken this approach. Can you tell me about that and what you uncovered exactly?
So these were some emails published under Freedom of Information between members of the Australian National Advisory Council on Alcohol and Other Drugs. So it's their role to provide some confidential advice to the Minister when it comes to drug and alcohol policy. Now, a lot of those experts and the experts who you can see are quite vocal and quite passionate in this email thread come from a harm reduction background. So they've worked in drug policy, they've kind of seen prohibition fail, and they're coming at it from that perspective. So the kind of things we saw them discussing in these emails were prohibition leads to black markets. In black markets, you've got unregulated and less safe products that can create further harm. And we've kind of seen that with regards to the vapes in that we have all kinds of products. We don't know how much nicotine is in them. We don't know what other chemicals are in them. And we aren't able to restrict who they're being accessed by because it's an unfettered market. So they were coming from the perspective of, well, enforcement we can see in the illicit drug trade is also really difficult. Like illicit drugs are still circulating Australia every day. The vaping black market could be a bit of a lost cause, and we would be better off potentially regulating those products like we do cigarettes, because stamping them out altogether won't necessarily work, and if it doesn't, this black market problem will continue. Tim,
I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this because the title of the story you wrote was, quote, It's a joke why young vaping addicts say regulations won't work. So what were young people saying to you about the government's decision to ban these disposable vapes?
Well, I mean, ban itself, the word ban is just a terrible word, isn't it? It sounds boring, and it's the whole essence of it is that you're being told something you can't do. And no one likes that, most of all kids, right? You hate being told what to do, what not to do and what you can't do. So instinctively, most kids push against that. And certainly all the kids I spoke to, almost all of them, including my daughters, were like, that won't work. We'll find them anyway. And also one of my daughters said, look at prohibition in the States, with alcohol in the 20s. That didn't work. That was a joke. It's ridiculous. Look at drugs. Drugs are, like Natassia says, that drugs are everywhere and they're banned, But I don't know. I just sort of think my take on it is that it's well and truly worth doing. If you can knock out, say, 80% of the trade in illicit vapes, I mean, no one's saying that a ban will stop it, everything. I mean, it's just like drugs. But if you knock out, say, 80% of the trade, then that's a pretty good result, And what's more, if you denormalise it, like the Australian government has with cigarette smoking, it's a great result. So I just think the government has a role in sending a message that it's a bad idea to use them. So I don't know, it sounds really boring and middle-aged of me, but I think it's a good idea to send that message to people, especially kids.
Natassia, I'm wondering why you think the federal government would go against expert advice on this with their blanket ban on vapes. Is it pressure from parents, from schools, or from medical groups? What do you think?
I think schools and parents have obviously been a big part of the conversation, at least the one that plays out in the media, because there is a really high level of concern. In terms of who I think Butler has listened to on this, people point out that Butler was in Parliament 10 years ago, also working in the health ministry under Nicola Roxon when plain packaging was introduced. So he's been in this space for a really long time. He was in the room when those discussions were happening and were really difficult when it came to cigarette reform 10 or so years ago. So I think he's seen that ambition really pay off. And while I think both vaping advocates and a lot of harm reduction experts aren't in favour of prohibition, from a public health perspective, this is something that doctors want, that the Lung Foundation wants, Cancer Council wants, Heart Foundation wants, and so forth, the AMA, the Australian Medical Association as well. So there is a real powerful, loud and influential public health stakeholder group who are supporting him on this. And from their perspective, getting rid of vapes would be the best option. So it is on some advice, as with all of these kind of policy debates, these different stakeholders are coming from different perspectives, and Butler has really leaned heavily on the public health argument in making this decision. I think the really core part, just what we were talking about before, will be, if you do get rid of these products, making the medical pathway accessible for people so they aren't either forced to turn to black market vapes or to tobacco, which will remain available. And one of the challenges here is, while the Royal Australian College of GPs has backed this move, it also doesn't really recommend vaping as a smoking cessation tool. So we'll actually need doctors to start recommending vaping devices to people who have found themselves addicted to vapes as a means of therefore quitting, so that they don't keep seeking out black market options. So I think that is one of the challenges in the medical space that looms.
So there's this very big public health push to ban them totally. But in your story, Natassia, what do the experts say the government should be doing instead? If not bans, what's the other option?
So I think the obvious option would be looking toward what analogous jurisdictions have done, such as New Zealand, Europe, North America, to varying levels of success. People wouldn't necessarily say what New Zealand has done has been good, because you do have heaps of kids vaping there as well. But what they have done is essentially regulate vapes more like cigarettes. And the option here would be, to reserve them for behind-the-counter sales in registered tobacco shops or otherwise, with the strict packaging, limited flavours, limiting nicotine content. So for people who want to vape and adults who choose to vape, or adults who are smokers and want to turn to vaping instead, that product remains accessible, but in a regulated form where we've got a better idea of what is in them and there aren't these kind of crazy quantities of nicotine.
There was a really interesting point in the correspondence you reported on, Natassia, showing that experts expressed concern about the media outlets and how some media outlets are flaming a moral panic about vaping. And I'm keen to get both of your thoughts on this. Do you get the sense that the problem might be overstated? And why do you think the media might be inflating this problem?
No, I don't think that the media inflames the problem really, particularly in this space. Like, kids know more about vapes than we do. If anything, reporting by the media on the vapes issue is always 10 steps behind. We're behind the 8 ball when it comes to reporting on vapes. And when I was talking to my 14-year-old, she was like, yeah, there's a group on the Northern Beaches who everybody knows the number. The mobile numbers are put on TikTok and WhatsApp, and you call them and they come around and deliver. They'll deliver how many vapes you want, and alcohol too if you want that. And really the most pernicious part is that it's the younger kids who have to go to the black market usually, because the older kids who look anything vaguely near 18 were able to go to a retail store and buy them. So really it's the younger kids, like the 14, 13-year-olds who are using that black market home delivery system. So no, I don't think the media overstates the problem. If anything, maybe it understates it, really. When I looked into the problem, it was bigger than I had any idea about.
I think it's a really tricky one because we don't have a huge amount of long-term research and evidence, and the research fields in this space are so disputed. So, if we get down, 15 years down the track and it turns out that vaping is actually a whole deal healthier for you than smoking, and we've deterred a whole group of smokers from switching to vaping by making it too hard to vape, that won't be a great outcome. On the other hand, if there are all these manifold damages to the body that we don't know about in 15 years, we would have made a really great decision. So it's hard to tell. I think, as with all things that kids are doing, it can seem great and scary for a different media generation that's often reporting on it. I do think that kids is the moral issue here because, again, when you look at the kind of problem of vaping in adults, it's probably less of a problem in that there are smokers who have switched to vaping or found vaping is a better alternative for them. There is a legitimate problem if you have a whole generation of new kids hooked on nicotine. But I think that's the balance that's really hard to tread in this policy, is dealing with the kids issue, which is very different to adult behaviours when you do consider that there is a more significant smoking population among adults. And I think that's something that harm reduction experts are also quite cautious about.
And the really big cloud of smoke in the room with this whole discussion is big tobacco making vapes, having grassroots organisations. How much does that complicate this conversation, Natassia?
So this is something you hear a lot from the medical groups. I think big tobacco is a very obvious and easy enemy to point a finger at. On the one hand, big tobacco companies such as Philip Morris, British American Tobacco, Imperial, they do all have their own vape products. And I'm sure in an ideal world for them, and what they have advocated in the past, is for a consumer model like cigarettes, so they can put their vapes on the market. So they do have a very substantial interest, not in what the government is doing. They are not at all in favour of that. At the same time, the black market as we see it today is flooded with products from China, which are kind of from tech companies that have started up for this purpose. So it's not the same big tobacco kind of behemoth that we're used to talking about, but it is definitely a player. And I think, just to add one thing there, the vested interests are a really interesting one to watch in this space, because even if it's not big tobacco, well then does big pharma or do pharmaceuticals step into that space? Like at the moment, for example, one of the main Australian brands of nicotine prescription vapes called Libre Pharmaceuticals, Chemist Warehouse has got an 8% stock in that company. And one of the things that Butler has floated is, okay, if enough doctors aren't prescribing vapes to make the medical model successful, there is a world in which we would allow pharmacists to sell them directly. Well, that creates another conflict of interest there if you have Chemist Warehouse both selling vapes and having a financial interest in the vaping company, that it could potentially down the track sell. So it's just there are so many competing interests when it comes to this issue, and I think that will only get more complicated, really, as we venture into these separate kind of medical pharmaceutical spaces for vape sales as well.
Well, Tim, Natassia, thanks so much for talking about a very complicated issue.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Chi Wong, with technical assistance from Debbie Harrington. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Rachel Clun. This is Inside Politics from Please Explain. Thanks for listening.